The bus jolted slightly as it pulled up to the stop. The muffled noise of the city slipped in for a moment before the doors hissed shut behind Morgan Freeman. He climbed the steps slowly, adjusting his coat, his sharp eyes sweeping across the crowded seats. It was full, as it always was in the late afternoon. Tired workers, students lost in their phones, vacant stares directed out of fogged-up windows. But something was wrong. The air inside was too still. Morgan noticed immediately. His gaze moved from one passenger to the next until it landed on a moment frozen in tension. A young black man, Darren, sat stiffly, his posture tight, beside an older white man with silver hair and a deeply lined face. The man had his arms crossed, his body leaning away, as if Darren carried some invisible disease. His expression was twisted in open disapproval. Morgan noticed the way the man was looking at Darren. Not just irritation, but something deeper, something uglier. Darren, for his part, kept his eyes on the floor, earbuds in, but not playing anything. His hands were curled into fists on his lap. A bus seat, just a seat. But it wasn't just that. The old man let out a loud, exaggerated huff, shifting in his seat with deliberate effort. A few passengers noticed. Some chose to ignore it. Then came the first strike. Kids these days think they own the world. It was spoken just loud enough to be heard, just quiet enough to be denied. A whisper laced with poison. Darren didn't move. Morgan watched. The old man cast a glance at the surrounding passengers, as if expecting approval. A man near the window looked away. A woman sighed, but said nothing. The silent approval of inaction. Then the old man turned slightly toward Darren and added, his voice coated in fake politeness, "You know, there are other open seats. You might be more comfortable somewhere else." Darren blinked slowly. His jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He didn't have to. The insult was clear. Morgan pressed his lips together. He had seen this before. Too many times. And the worst part wasn't the old man, it wasn't the words. It was the silence around them. He scanned the bus. Yes, there were open seats. But why should Darren move? The old man cleared his throat, impatient. "Did you hear me? There's space for you somewhere else." Darren's fingers tightened over the fabric of his jeans. He inhaled through his nose, biting back a response. Morgan didn't wait any longer. He stepped forward, moving steadily down the aisle. When he reached the pair of seats, he stopped, and then, in a voice smooth as thunder, he said, "You know, I think you're right." The old man's forehead creased. His eyes narrowed in suspicion. Darren blinked, confused. Morgan turned to Darren and smiled. "Mind switching seats with me?" The entire bus held its breath. Darren hesitated. He looked between Morgan and the old man, then at the other passengers. They were watching now. The silence wasn't just heavy anymore. It was suffocating. The old man shuffled uncomfortably in his seat. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. Morgan stood there, calm, waiting. After a long pause, Darren nodded and slowly stood up. His shoulders were stiff as he walked past Morgan toward an open seat, but his expression held something new, something unreadable. Then Morgan sat down beside the old man, and the bus held its breath again. The old man stiffened. He shifted in his seat, but Morgan didn't move. He didn't need to speak yet. He was simply there. The dynamic had shifted. The passengers, once disengaged, were now paying attention. The old man realized it too. Now he was the one being watched. Tension crackled in the air like static. The bus rolled forward, but no one truly relaxed. Morgan breathed in deeply. Now it was time to speak. The bus rattled along the worn asphalt, the hum of the engine, the only sound breaking the heavy silence. The old man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his body still angled away from Morgan, but now for a different reason. Morgan sat beside him, calm, composed, as if this were any other ride on any other day. It wasn't. The tension hung in the air, thick and unspoken. Passengers stole glances but quickly looked away. The bus was full, yet somehow the space around them felt isolated, like a battlefield drawn in the middle of a crowded street. The old man let out a sharp breath, his jaw tight. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not like this, without force, without anger, just presence. Morgan turned his head slightly, studying the man with a quiet patience. Then, in a voice that cut through the silence like a blade wrapped in silk, he asked, "What exactly was the problem?" The old man blinked, his shoulders tensing. He wasn't expecting a question. He was expecting an argument, a confrontation, something loud and easy to dismiss. But this was different. "Problem?" he repeated, his voice hoarse. Morgan nodded, his tone light, almost conversational. "You wanted the young man to move, so what was the problem?" A few passengers turned their heads slightly, pretending not to listen, but hanging on to every word. Darren, sitting 2 rows ahead, kept his gaze forward, but his fingers gripped the edge of his seat. The old man scoffed, shaking his head. "Come on, you know what this is about." Morgan tilted his head, his eyes steady. "I do, but I'd like to hear you say it." The old man shifted again, rubbing his fingers together, glancing toward the front of the bus as if looking for an escape. There was none. Morgan waited. The silence pressed down, patient, relentless. Finally, the old man muttered, almost to himself, "People should sit where they belong." Morgan exhaled slowly, nodding once, as if he had expected that very answer. "And where exactly is that?" The old man's lips parted, but no words came. He glanced around, realizing that more passengers were now openly looking. The woman across from him, the man near the window, even the bus driver's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. There were no allies in this crowd, no approving nods, just faces waiting to see what he would say next. He swallowed. "You know what I mean," he muttered. Morgan leaned back slightly, his gaze never wavering. "I do, but I don't think you do." That landed. The old man's fingers twitched against his knee. Darren turned his head slightly now, just enough to watch from. The corner of his eye. The bus driver's gaze flickered again to the mirror. The bus wasn't just a mode of transportation anymore. It was a stage, and the old man was standing on it, naked in front of his own reflection. Morgan continued, his voice quiet, deliberate. "You ever ask yourself why it bothers you so much?" The old man scoffed, his defense mechanism kicking in. "Oh, don't start that psychological nonsense. It's not like that." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "Isn't it?" The old man turned toward him now, fully facing him for the first time. His expression was a mix of annoyance and something else, something deeper. Morgan recognized it instantly. Recognition, not of Morgan but of himself, of the fact that the man sitting next to him wasn't treating him like an enemy. He was treating him like a question that had been left unanswered for too long. Morgan's voice softened, but the weight of it didn't. "Tell me something." The old man's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "What?" Morgan's eyes locked onto his. "Did someone tell you to move once?" The old man froze. For the first time, his hands trembled slightly on his lap. He clenched them into fists to stop it. Morgan saw it. The shift. Passengers exchanged glances. Darren turned fully now, staring at the old man. The old man's mouth opened, then closed. And just like that, the past had caught up to him. The bus hit a pothole, jolting everyone forward slightly, but no one moved more than the old man. Morgan watched as something flickered in his eyes, something buried beneath layers of time, of choices, of unspoken regrets. The bus rolled on, and for the first time, the old man had nowhere left to run. The old man sat still, his fingers flexing on his knee, his throat tight. The bus rattled along the uneven road, but the real turbulence was inside him. Morgan waited. The question still hung in the air, heavy, suffocating. "Did someone tell you to move once?" For a moment the old man's face hardened, his defenses rising like walls he had spent years building. "What kind of question is that?" he scoffed, shaking his head. "That was a different time." Morgan nodded slowly. "Was it?" The old man frowned. Morgan's voice remained calm, but there was no escape from the weight of his words. "Tell me about it," the old man huffed. "Ain't nothing to tell," but the way his gaze flickered, the slight tremor in his fingers, said otherwise. The bus was quiet. No one had spoken since Morgan had sat down. A woman near the front pretended to read a book but hadn't turned the page. A man near the window had his phone in his hand, screen dimmed, forgotten. Even Darren, who had sat in silence for so long, was turned slightly in his seat now, watching, waiting. The old man felt it, all of it. His jaw tightened. He tried to stare ahead, tried to shrug off the weight of the moment, but Morgan's presence made it impossible. The silence around them wasn't just emptiness anymore, it was expectation. Finally, after what felt like forever, the old man exhaled, sharply. "I was just a kid," he muttered, almost to himself. Morgan didn't move. "Go on." The old man clenched his fists, as if bracing himself for something he didn't want to remember. "It was a long time ago," he said, voice rough. "Things were different back then." Morgan simply watched. The old man swallowed hard. "I was maybe 10, 11, he continued. "My mother and I got on a bus. It was packed, real full. We had to stand." A pause. A long, heavy pause. Morgan's voice came softer now. "And then?" The old man looked down at his hands, then at the floor. "Then someone offered us a seat." Morgan didn't speak. He just let the moment breathe. The old man blinked a few times, his voice quieter now. "It was a black woman." A murmur rippled through the passengers. Darren sat up straighter. The old man's voice had lost its edge. "She was sitting up front. She saw me holding onto my mom's arm, trying to keep my balance. And she just got up. Just like that." The memory played in his mind now as real as the day it had happened. He could see it, feel it, the way his mother had hesitated, the way the woman had smiled. "She smiled at me like it was nothing," he muttered, "like it was just what people do." The bus rocked gently as it rolled on. Morgan's voice was barely above a whisper. "And what did you do?" The old man swallowed again. "I sat down." The words felt small, insignificant, but they weren't. Everyone in the bus knew it. Morgan nodded once, leaning slightly forward. "And did it bother you?" The old man hesitated, his lips parted. But no words came, because he knew the answer, and so did Morgan. "Did it bother you back then?" A long pause. Finally, the old man exhaled. "No." His voice was almost regretful. Morgan watched him carefully. "Then, why does it bother you now?" The old man looked away sharply, his face twisting, his walls crumbling. Darren was staring openly now. Everyone was. The old man knew it. He felt the weight of their eyes, but it wasn't judgment. It was something worse. It was the realization that everyone, including himself, was waiting to see who he would be next. The old man's lips pressed into a thin line, his breath uneven. The bus rumbled forward, but inside, time had stopped for him. Morgan didn't push. He didn't need to. The silence itself was enough. The old man's fingers drummed against his knee, his body rigid, as if fighting against a current he had spent years ignoring. He swallowed. "Things change," Morgan nodded, his voice steady. "They do," the old man exhaled sharply. "The world isn't what it used to be." Morgan studied him. "No, it's not." The old man finally turned his head, meeting Morgan's gaze for the first time without hostility. "Back then people knew their place." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "And you think that was a good thing?" The old man hesitated, but only for a fraction of a second. "It worked. Life made sense." Morgan leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "For who?" The old man's face twitched. Darren, sitting a few rows ahead, was still listening, his head slightly turned. His fingers were no longer gripping the seat. The tension in the bus had changed. The old man's voice dropped lower, almost like he was talking to himself. The rules were clear. People didn't have to walk around wondering what was right or wrong. You knew. Morgan's gaze softened. "You mean "You were told?" The old man flinched. A moment stretched between them, too thick to ignore. Morgan exhaled, then spoke again, this time with something gentler in his tone. "Do you ever think about her?" The old man frowned. "Who?" "The woman who gave up her seat for you." The old man stiffened. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. Morgan watched, his silence coaxing out something the old man hadn't spoken of in decades. "Oh, she didn't have to do that," he muttered, voice almost hoarse. "But she did." Morgan nodded. "Why do you think she did?" The old man let out a bitter laugh. "Hell if I know." Morgan tilted his head. "I think you do." The old man clenched his jaw. His memory drifted. Back to the bus, back to being that small boy gripping his mother's hand, looking up at a stranger who had smiled at him with kindness instead of resentment, a black woman, dressed in simple clothes, tired from a long day, choosing to stand so that a little white boy could sit. His mother had thanked her hesitantly. The woman had just nodded and said something he hadn't thought about in years. And then, just like that, the bus had moved on. He had never seen her again. Morgan's voice cut through his thoughts. "You see, that's the thing about moments like that." The old man looked at him. Morgan's gaze was steady, warm. "They never really leave you." The old man's fingers twitched against his knee. He looked down at them, at the hands of a man who had spent his life clenching onto something he didn't even understand. A deep breath. The bus jolted slightly, but he barely noticed. Morgan spoke again, softer now. "She made a choice that day, and now, here we are." The old man's throat tightened. Morgan's words hung between them, offering something fragile, something real. A choice. The old man wasn't sure if he liked what he saw in himself, and that, more than anything else, terrified him. The bus continued forward, but inside that seat, a man's past had just caught up with him. The old man swallowed hard. His fingers twitched against his knee as if trying to hold onto something slipping through his grasp. Morgan didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The silence around them was louder than any argument, heavier than any accusation. It wasn't pressure. It was space. Space for the old man to see himself. The bus rolled forward, passengers pretending not to stare, but hanging onto every second. Darren, still sitting a few rows ahead, watched without turning his head, his jaw tight. The old man exhaled sharply. "I don't know why she did it." Morgan's gaze didn't waver. "She did it because she could." The old man scoffed, shaking his head. "That's not a reason." Morgan's voice was quiet but firm. "It is, if you understand it." The old man frowned. Morgan leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "She didn't stand up because she had to. She didn't stand up because she was told to. She stood up because she had a choice, and she made it." The old man inhaled deeply, his shoulders rising and falling. Morgan watched as the words settled in. A choice. The memory flickered back, the woman's gentle smile, the way she had met his eyes with warmth instead of resentment. She had chosen kindness, and now, decades later, he had chosen the opposite. Morgan tilted his head slightly. "And you? When did you stop making choices?" The old man's jaw clenched, his fingers curled into fists, because that question hit somewhere deep, somewhere raw. Darren was looking at him now, fully turned in his seat, waiting. Everyone was waiting. The old man cleared his throat. I never... But the words didn't come, because the truth was he had no answer. At some point the boy on that bus had grown into a man who forgot what it felt like to be given grace. Morgan nodded as if he understood that silence better than words. Then, softly, almost like he wasn't asking the old man, but asking the boy he used to be, he said, "So, who do you want to be now?" The bus seemed to exhale with him. The old man swallowed hard, his throat dry. He felt like everyone was watching, because they were. But for the first time, they weren't judging. They were waiting for a choice. The old man looked down at his hands, at the years of bitterness etched into his knuckles, and slowly, hesitantly, he unclenched his fists. Morgan watched. Darren watched. The entire bus held its breath. The old man had spent his whole life gripping onto something he no longer understood, and now, maybe for the first time in years, he was letting go. The old man stared at his open hands as if they belonged to someone else. Someone younger, someone he had forgotten. Morgan didn't move. He just waited. The bus had gone from a simple ride home to something deeper, something heavier. A moment of reckoning. Darren watched, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The other passengers weren't pretending anymore. They were listening. The old man inhaled sharply. "I don't know how I got here." His voice wasn't strong this time. It wasn't sharp or defensive. It was quiet, almost fragile. Morgan tilted his head slightly. "You do," the old man blinked, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. Morgan's voice remained calm, but his words landed like stones in water. "At some point, you stopped seeing the boy on that bus, and you became the man sitting here now." The old man clenched his jaw. His past, the one he had buried under years of bitterness, was staring him in the face. He had been a scared little boy gripping his mother's hand, trying to keep his balance. And a stranger had given him something. A choice, a moment of kindness. And what had he done with it? The weight of it settled deep in his chest. Morgan leaned in slightly, voice quieter now. "You weren't always like this, were you?" The old man blinked fast, looking away, his breathing uneven. Darren shifted in his seat, eyes fixed on him. The old man could feel the weight of his stare. Morgan didn't need to push. The old man was already seeing it, the truth of it. He had become the very thing he once feared, a man who looked at a kid like Darren and saw nothing but a problem. A man who had forgotten that, once, he had been in that same seat. His chest rose and fell in uneven breaths. And then, for the first time, he looked at Darren, really looked at him. The kid was just a kid, not a threat, not a problem, just someone who had every right to be here. The old man's lips parted, but no words came. Morgan exhaled, leaning back. "The bus keeps moving," he said, "but you decide where you go." The words hung in the air. Darren didn't speak. He just watched. The old man felt the weight of their eyes, but this time it wasn't judgment. It was expectation. For the first time in a long, long time, he had a choice. The old man exhaled slowly, his fingers curling against his knee before releasing again. He still hadn't spoken. The bus rumbled on, rocking gently over the uneven pavement, but inside everything felt still. Morgan's words lingered in the air. "The bus keeps moving, but you decide where you go." The old man swallowed hard. He knew exactly what Morgan meant. Darren was still watching him. Arms crossed, shoulders tense, lips pressed into a firm line. He wasn't expecting an apology. He was expecting nothing at all. And somehow, that made it worse. Because if the kid didn't expect anything, what did that say about the world he had learned to live in? The old man clenched his jaw, his throat tight. He wasn't sure who he was anymore. But he knew one thing. He didn't want to be the man he had just seen in himself. He licked his lips, hesitated, then finally turned toward Darren. His voice was rough, strained, like it had rusted over time. "Kid," Darren raised an eyebrow. Skeptical, the old man cleared his throat, as if the words physically hurt to say. "You don't gotta move." Darren blinked. His expression didn't change at first, like he wasn't sure he had really heard it. Then, slowly, his posture shifted. Not relaxed. Not open, but less rigid. He studied the old man, eyes sharp. "I know," the old man swallowed. That was fair. Morgan, quiet all this time, finally nodded. "That's a start," the old man exhaled, rubbing his hands together. They felt different. Now, lighter. The bus hit a bump, and a murmur of movement rippled through the passengers. But the atmosphere had changed. People weren't just watching anymore. They had witnessed something shift. Morgan turned back toward the front of the bus. His face unreadable, Darren did the same, and the old man, after a long moment, followed. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't gripping onto something that wasn't his to hold. The bus rolled forward, but now, so did he. The hum of the engine filled the space between them. The city blurred past the windows, headlights flickering like distant stars. No one spoke. But something had changed. Morgan felt it. The old man sat stiffly, his hands resting on his lap. He wasn't gripping his knee anymore. His fingers weren't curled into fists. The weight he had carried for years was still there, but it had shifted. And Darren sat with his shoulders a little looser. He wasn't looking at the old man, wasn't waiting for another comment, another fight, because there wouldn't be one. Morgan glanced at him, a quiet understanding passing between them. This wasn't just about the old man. It was about everyone who had watched and said nothing, the woman across from them who had kept her eyes on her book but hadn't turned the page. The man near the window who had clutched his phone but never pressed record. The bus driver who had seen everything in the mirror but never stopped the ride. Morgan finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "It's easy to sit still." A few passengers shifted. Morgan leaned back, adjusting his coat. "It's easy to look away, to think, this isn't my fight." Silence. "But it is." The words landed like a slow, rolling wave. The old man inhaled deeply. Darren's eyes flickered toward Morgan, listening. The bus driver cleared his throat, gripping the wheel a little tighter. Morgan's voice remained calm, but it carried weight. "You don't have to be the one speaking to be part of the conversation. You don't have to be the one acting to be making a choice." He let that settle. "The bus keeps moving, and so do we, but every single one of us decides how we move forward." No one argued, no one protested, because they knew he was right. The bus slowed, pulling up to a stop. The doors hissed open, and a few passengers shuffled out, a little quieter, a little more thoughtful. The old man didn't move. Darren stayed seated. Morgan looked at them both, then stood. He grabbed the overhead rail, steadying himself before stepping toward the exit. Before he left, he turned slightly, meeting Darren's gaze. "You good?" Darren held his stare for a beat. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Yeah," Morgan nodded back. Then, after a pause, he glanced at the old man. The old man didn't speak at first, but just as Morgan turned to go, he muttered something, so low it almost got lost in the sound of the engine. "Thank you." Morgan hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then he just smiled. "Take care, son." And with that he stepped off the bus. The doors shut behind him. The bus pulled away, and inside, though the seats stayed the same, none of them would ever sit quite the same way again. Before you go, if this story moved you, if you believe in respect, kindness, and standing up for what's right, then help us spread the message. Like this video to show your support. Subscribe for more powerful stories that inspire change. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Together, we can create a world where everyone belongs. See you in the next story.